In the rural hills of western Pennsylvania exists a collection of church relics that no historian can properly trace. Small bone fragments and preserved flesh sit within ornate reliquaries across 17 different congregations stretching from Philadelphia to the frontier settlements, their origins obscured by time and deliberate deception. Between 1745 and 1792, over 73 individuals vanished from these communities, devout men, women, and, most disturbingly, orphan children, all later declared saints by local religious leaders. What few know is that a sealed record in the Philadelphia Historical Society contains the testimonies of 3 witnesses who discovered the truth. The Whitmore Family Workshop, where human bodies were processed into holy relics for nearly 5 decades. For centuries, the manuscript has remained sealed at the request of the churches involved. But through careful research, I have uncovered the horrifying truth that the religious establishment has desperately tried to keep hidden. Before we continue with the story of the Whitmore family's gruesome enterprise, hit the subscribe button if you're brave enough to hear historical horrors that few channels dare to reveal. Let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Perhaps your local church holds secrets you never imagined. Now, let's delve deeper into this disturbing chapter of American religious history. Far beyond what most historians are willing to acknowledge, the true horror of what happened in those Pennsylvania woods extends, affecting communities whose descendants worship in those same churches to this day. In the mid-18th century, the colony of Pennsylvania existed as a unique religious haven. While the Quakers dominated Philadelphia and its surrounding counties with their plain meeting houses and emphasis on inner light, the Western Territory saw a blend of Protestant denominations, Presbyterian, Lutheran, and smaller Christian sects, each establishing modest wooden churches as they pushed further into frontier lands claimed from native peoples. From England in 1742, the Whitmore family arrived, settling in Chester County approximately 30 miles west of Philadelphia, where rolling hills gave way to dense forests and scattered farmsteads. Presenting himself as a skilled craftsman of religious items, Nathaniel Whitmore, a stern-faced man with penetrating grey eyes and a trimmed beard that framed his angular jawline, created chalices, communion plates, and ornate Bible covers that quickly gained favor among the wealthier congregations. Situated on 12 acres of wooded land, his workshop was a 2-story timber structure that featured large windows flooding the main floor with natural light. There he would receive ministers and church elders who commissioned his increasingly sought-after work. Managing their household and 4 children with a precision that neighbors found admirable, if somewhat cold, was his wife, Elizabeth, a slender woman with delicate hands and an unnerving ability to maintain a placid expression regardless of circumstances. At Harmony Meeting House, a modest Quaker gathering, the Whitmores attended Sunday services, where they sat quietly during worship, occasionally offering measured testimonies that impressed the congregation with their apparent spiritual depth. In the workshop, their eldest son, Thomas, assisted his father, while daughters Mary and Sarah helped their mother with household duties. Often spending hours alone in the woods, the youngest, William, a frail boy with an unsettling intensity in his gaze, would return with plants and small animal specimens that he meticulously preserved in his room, a hobby his parents encouraged as a scientific pursuit. In those years, Chester County faced the typical challenges of colonial life, harsh winters, occasional crop failures, and the constant tension of frontier existence. Yet it was also a time of religious fervor and economic growth. Through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, the Great Awakening had swept, leaving in its wake a heightened spiritual awareness and competition between denominations for souls and status. Not only through doctrine but through the quality of their buildings and religious artifacts, churches sought to distinguish themselves. Perfectly positioned to serve this market were the Whites. Above local competitors, Nathaniel's craftsmanship elevated him, and by 1745 his workshop had expanded to include 2 apprentices, Jacob Miller, the orphan son of German immigrants, and Peter Collins, a quiet young man from a poor family in Philadelphia. Though not ostentatiously, the family lived comfortably, gaining a reputation for industriousness and piety that served as an effective mask for what occurred behind the workshop's closed doors after sunset. It was in late autumn of 1745 when Mary Collins, a devout Quaker woman known for her healing work among the poor, disappeared while traveling home from visiting a sick family on the outskirts of the county. Causing brief concern, her disappearance was eventually attributed to an Indian attack or wild animal encounter, as happened often in colonial times. What no one knew then was that Mary Collins represented the beginning of a horrifying enterprise that would continue undetected for nearly half a century. On November 17, 1745, as an early winter storm descended upon Chester County, Mary Collins made her final journey along the rutted path that led past the Whitmore property. The sky had darkened prematurely, heavy clouds promising snow as the wind drove brittle leaves across the frozen ground. Pulling her woolen cloak tighter, Mary, a widow of 43 years with grey-streaked hair and hands weathered from decades of charitable work, quickened her pace as she passed the lantern light glowing from the Whitmore workshop. According to Thomas Whitmore's confession, written years later from his deathbed and discovered hidden in the wall of a Philadelphia prison cell, his father had been watching Mary Collins for weeks. Father said her reputation for saintliness would make her perfect, Thomas wrote in shaky script. He told us God had revealed to him a great purpose, a way to bring true holiness to the colonies through sacred vessels. As Mary passed the property, Nathaniel emerged from the trees, lantern in hand, calling for assistance. With his voice tinged with practiced desperation, he explained that his son William had wandered into the woods and failed to return. Despite the approaching storm, Mary, known for her kindness, did not hesitate to offer her help. She followed Nathaniel deeper into the property, away from the road, and toward a small clearing where the workshop's rear entrance stood, partially concealed by a stand of pine trees. I watched from the window as Father led her inside, Thomas's confession continued. Mother had prepared the back room with canvas cloths covering the floor. I didn't understand yet what they intended. I was 16 and believed when they spoke of creating sacred relics, they meant crafting representations, not the handwriting here became illegible, as if the writer's hand had trembled too violently to form coherent letters. Mercifully undetailed in Thomas's account remained what happened in that back room, but the aftermath was described with disturbing precision. Over the following 3 days, Mary Collins's body was methodically processed. Having studied preservation techniques from medical texts brought from England, Nathaniel taught his eldest son how to treat human tissue with a mixture of salt, herbs, and other substances to prevent decay. From black velvet, Elizabeth Whitmore sewed small pouches of varying sizes, each embroidered with golden religious symbols. Father said we were doing God's work, Thomas wrote. He said the Protestant churches of America lacked the sacred relics that gave the Catholic Church its power and that we would provide what was needed to elevate true worship in the colonies. I believed him then. God forgive me. I believed him. 2 weeks after Mary Collins' disappearance, Nathaniel Whitmore traveled to Philadelphia carrying several ornate wooden boxes of his own crafting. He returned with more commissions than ever before and a considerable sum of money. At the next Quaker meeting, he spoke movingly about the loss of our dear friend Mary and suggested a special memorial service be held. During this service, he presented the meeting house with an exquisitely crafted altar box, explaining that he had made it in Mary's honor. What the congregation did not know was that sealed within a hidden compartment of that box was a small piece of Mary Collins herself, the first of what would become hundreds of sacred relics distributed throughout the colonies over the following decades. Passing into spring, the winter of 1745 brought rumors from Philadelphia, whispers of miraculous healings attributed to a holy relic held by a small Episcopal church in the city. Claiming that a fragment of bone from an unknown 18th century saint had cured 3 parishioners of their ailments, the rector there said the bone had been acquired from a European dealer through a local craftsman. That craftsman was Nathaniel Whitmore. Considerably by 1750, the Whitmore family's business had expanded. Doubling in size, their workshop now employed 5 apprentices who crafted the visible products, the ornate boxes, chalices, and religious items that served as the family's public face. None of these young men were permitted access to the cellar rooms beneath the workshop, where the true business of the Whiters took place. A substantial two-story structure of stone and timber that stood as testament to their growing wealth was also constructed by the family as a new home. From local memory, the disappearance of Mary Collins had long faded, replaced by occasional reports of other missing persons. A visiting preacher here, a devout elderly woman there, typically individuals without strong family connections, whose absences could be explained away by the dangers of colonial travel or the ever-convenient Indian troubles along the frontier. What changed in this period was the Whitmore's method of selecting their victims. Mother developed what she called the discernment, Sarah Whitmore wrote in a journal discovered in 1823 during the demolition of the family's abandoned home. She could identify those whose bodies would produce the most powerful relics. She claimed God spoke to her, revealing which souls were destined for sainthood after death. Allowing the family to see their actions not as murder, but as a divine calling, this chilling rationalization meant they were merely helping these chosen individuals achieve their heavenly purpose earlier than nature intended. Their approach to creating and distributing the relics had also been refined by the Whites. Throughout Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and as far south as Virginia, Nathaniel established connections with church leaders. Through donations, exceptional craftsmanship, and the strategic sharing of confidential information about European religious artifacts becoming available through his supposed overseas connections, these relationships were carefully cultivated. Father told them that the Catholic Church in Europe had hoarded sacred power for centuries, Thomas's confession explained. He convinced these Protestant ministers that acquiring relics quietly, discreetly would bring the same power to their congregations without embracing Catholic doctrine. His arguments were especially effective with ambitious church leaders seeking to grow their flocks. A network of collaborators, mostly unwitting, was included in the family's expanded operation, who would report back on the miracles occurring in churches possessing Whitmore-provided relics. With other potential buyers, these accounts would then be shared, creating demand that commanded increasingly higher prices. To keep the relic's existence secret from the general congregation, Nathaniel instructed church leaders, presenting them as a sacred trust known only to church elders, a strategy that limited exposure while enhancing the perceived value of these objects. What none of their customers knew was that the ancient European saints' relics they purchased at such dear cost were created in the Whitmore cellar from the bodies of their own neighbors and countrymen. In the spring of 1753, a physician from Lancaster named Dr. Samuel Winters began asking uncomfortable questions after examining a healing relic at the request of a patient who claimed to have been cured by touching it. His careful inspection revealed that the preserved tissue could not possibly be as old as claimed, and the preservation methods appeared inconsistent with European techniques. Before he could pursue his investigation further, Dr. Winters disappeared while traveling between Lancaster and Philadelphia. His body was never found, but a small wooden case containing what was claimed to be the finger bone of a 12th-century healer appeared in a Presbyterian church in New York the following month. The years passed and the pattern continued. Into the family business, the Whitmore children grew with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Becoming his father's primary assistant was Thomas, the eldest, while William, the youngest and most disturbing of the siblings, developed a particular talent for the preservation process, experimenting with techniques that allowed for the creation of more convincing relics. The financial aspects and correspondence were managed by the daughters, Mary and Sarah, maintaining the family's respectable facade while laundering the considerable profits through legitimate business ventures. Toward revolution, the American colonies moved, and with the political upheaval came new opportunities for the Whites. A shortage of religious items was created by the disruption of trade with England, positioning their workshop as one of the few reliable sources for churches throughout the colonies. Without becoming too closely identified with either side, the family was careful to demonstrate appropriate patriotic sentiment, a neutrality that allowed them to continue their trade regardless of which faction controlled their territory at any given time. As the Revolutionary War approached its conclusion, a disturbing new chapter in the Whitmore family business began, one that would eventually lead to their downfall. The year was 1781. And while the colonies celebrated their impending independence, the Whites identified a new and particularly profitable market for their gruesome products. Significant changes to the religious landscape of the newly formed United States were brought by the end of the Revolutionary War. Requiring rebuilding were churches damaged during the conflict, and a spiritual revival swept through communities seeking meaning after years of bloodshed. Unprecedented demand for religious artifacts was created by this environment, and the Whitmores recognized an opportunity to expand their macabre enterprise. In February of 1782, the first orphan child disappeared from a church-run asylum in Philadelphia. Placed in the care of the Episcopal Church after losing his parents to smallpox the previous winter was 10-year-old Joseph Miller. Small for his age, with solemn eyes and a reputation for unusual piety, Joseph often led the other children in prayer and was favored by the clergy who oversaw the asylum. Noted, investigated briefly, and ultimately attributed to running away, a common occurrence in such institutions, was his disappearance. 3 months later, a series of miraculous events surrounding a newly acquired relic, supposedly the preserved heart of a child martyr from the early church, was reported by the Church of St. Michael in eastern Pennsylvania. Resulting in extraordinary answers, particularly those concerning children's illnesses, were prayers offered before this relic, parishioners claimed. The church's attendance swelled and donations increased dramatically. Spreading word of these miracles created demand among other churches for similar powerful relics. William suggested the children. Sarah Whitmore's journal revealed in a passage written in a shaky hand, the ink blotched as if by fallen tears. He said their innocence made them more powerful vessels for divine work. Father hesitated at first, but the prophet potential convinced him. God help me. I knew it was wrong. Yet I said nothing. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing phase of the Whitmores' operation. Between 1782 and 1785, at least 16 children, all orphans or from destitute families, vanished from communities within a day's ride of the Whitmore property. A brief stir was created by each disappearance before being attributed to the usual suspects: wilderness dangers, child traffickers bound for distant cities, or simply the harsh realities of life for unprotected minors in the early Republic. During this same period, the market for child saint relics flourished among certain churches. 5 times higher than adult relics were the prices commanded by these items, justified by their supposed spiritual potency and rarity. Wealthier than ever grew the Whitmores, investing their blood money in land, businesses, and political connections that further insulated them from suspicion. However, necessitating more hands, the increased scale of their operation forced the family to partially initiate 2 trusted apprentices into their secrets. One of these men, Daniel Foster, would later become central to the family's undoing. In the autumn of 1785, a Quaker minister named Elijah Thompson was appointed by the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting to investigate concerns about irregular religious practices in outlying communities. A methodical man with a background in law before his conversion to the Society of Friends, Thompson had earned a reputation for untangling complex church disputes with both diplomacy and unwavering principle. I was tasked with examining the troubling reports of Catholic-like practices involving relics and saint worship that had infiltrated even our plain Quaker meetings, Thompson wrote in his journal, now preserved in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's sealed collection. Such idolatry runs counter to our belief in direct communion with the divine. Yet several meeting houses had acquired special objects said to enhance spiritual experiences. Beginning in Philadelphia, Thompson's investigation noticed a curious pattern. Back to Nathaniel Whitmore or his associates ultimately traced many of the relics that had been acquired through intermediaries. The provenance of these items, while elaborate in detail, lacked verifiable historical connections, the minister also observed. In December 1785, Thompson traveled to Chester County to meet with Nathaniel Whitmore directly. His journal describes their encounter. Whitmore received me graciously in his well-appointed home, offering refreshments and conversation that demonstrated considerable knowledge of theological matters. When I inquired about the religious artifacts his workshop produced, he showed me his public workroom where apprentices crafted beautiful communion ware and decorative items for churches. He spoke at length about his connections with European suppliers of ancient relics, providing documentation that, while impressive to look upon, contained inconsistencies that my legal training could not overlook. Troubled, but without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, Thompson left the meeting. He continued his investigation, interviewing church leaders who had purchased Whitmore relics and cataloguing the miracles attributed to them. A disturbing pattern emerged. However tenuous, some connection to the Whitmore family or their associates was had by the witnesses involved in the most dramatic miracles. I began to suspect a deliberate scheme to manufacture not only the relics themselves, but the miracles attributed to them, Thompson wrote. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly in different communities, testifying to wondrous events before moving on. When tracked, their movements formed a web with the Whitmore property at its center. As Thompson's investigation intensified, strange occurrences began to plague him. From his lodgings, items went missing. Its intended recipients failed to reach his correspondence. Most disturbingly, from his locked trunk while he slept at a roadside inn, evidence he had collected, notes, witness testimonies, and documentation of inconsistencies, disappeared. In February 1786, Thompson returned to Philadelphia to present his findings to the yearly meeting committee that had commissioned his investigation. The night before his presentation, he attended a dinner at the home of a respected Quaker elder. During the meal, Thompson became violently ill. Diagnosing poisoning, though the source could not be identified, were physicians. He survived, but remained weakened for months, forcing a temporary halt to his investigation. During Thompson's convalescence, a new character entered the narrative, one who would ultimately help expose the true horror of the Whitmore family business. The apprentice who had been partially initiated into the family's secrets, Daniel Foster, began experiencing what he described as unbearable attacks of conscience. After witnessing the processing of a child's body, reportedly that of a 12-year-old orphan girl from a Methodist children's home, Foster fled the Whitmore compound in the middle of the night, taking with him a journal in which he had secretly documented dates, names, and details of the family's activities. To Philadelphia, Foster made his way, where, after weeks of gathering courage, he approached Elijah Thompson with his testimony. Listening in horror to Foster's account was the Quaker minister, still recovering from his poisoning. The young man shook violently as he spoke, Thompson recorded. He described a cellar chamber beneath the Whitmore workshop where bodies were suspended from hooks like butchered animals, bodily fluids draining into collection vessels. He spoke of specialized tools for removing bone, muscle, and organs with minimal damage, and of preservation techniques involving salt, alcohol, and herbs that allowed human tissue to maintain a lifelike appearance for months or years. Most disturbing was Foster's description of the family's demeanor during these activities, calm, methodical, even reverent, as if performing sacred rites rather than desecrating human remains. He reported that Nathaniel and Elizabeth Whitmore regularly led prayers before and after these processing sessions, thanking God for choosing these vessels for his divine purpose and asking blessing upon those who would receive the sacred gifts created from the bodies. Armed with Foster's testimony and journal, Thompson prepared to take action. However, before he could present this evidence to authorities, a devastating fire destroyed his Philadelphia residence, claiming all of Foster's documentation. The following day, the apprentice himself vanished. His fate unknown until partial remains identified by unique boot buckles were discovered in the Delaware River 3 weeks later. Undeterred, Thompson continued his investigation with even greater caution. No longer keeping written records and sharing information only with his most trusted associates, he developed an elaborate system of coded messages and multiple informants, slowly rebuilding his case against the Whitmore family. By late 1786, Thompson had connected at least 27 disappearances to the Whitmore operation and identified 9 churches that unknowingly housed human remains disguised as sacred relics. What he still lacked was physical evidence that would convince skeptical authorities to move against a family that had by then cultivated powerful connections throughout Pennsylvania society. From an unexpected source, Sarah Whitmore herself, came the opportunity to obtain such evidence. To Pennsylvania, the winter of 1787 brought unusually heavy snows, isolating the Whitmore compound for weeks at a time. During this period of forced seclusion, fractures within the family deepened. Who had maintained her journal in secret for years, Sarah Whitmore, began to crumble under the psychological weight of her complicity. Now 32 and unmarried, her father had discouraged suitors who might have taken her away from the family business. She found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. "I can no longer sleep without seeing their faces," she wrote in December 1787. "The children especially haunt me." William has become something inhuman in his enthusiasms. Last week he spoke of experimenting with preservation techniques that would allow for entire limbs to be marketed as intact relics. Mother encouraged him, speaking of the profit potential while quoting scripture about the sanctification of holy vessels. "I cannot bear much more of this." With an escalation in the family's activities coincided Sarah's crisis of conscience. The success of their child relics had emboldened them, particularly William, whose role had expanded as Nathaniel aged. Now 27, William had developed refinements to their preservation techniques that allowed for more convincing relics and consequently higher prices. For increased production, he pushed, arguing that the post-revolution spiritual hunger created a market they should fully exploit. Requiring more victims, this acceleration created greater risks of discovery. Targeting remote frontier settlements where disappearances would attract less attention was William's proposed solution. Now showing signs of the illness that would eventually claim his life, Nathaniel conceded leadership to his youngest son, despite Thomas's objections that such expansion invited unnecessary danger. In January 1788, two incidents occurred that set in motion the family's eventual exposure. First, William returned from a 2-week journey to western Pennsylvania with 3 new subjects, all children from a remote settlement devastated by winter illness. In such quick succession, the processing of these victims overwhelmed even the family's efficient system, forcing them to store partially preserved remains in the workshop cellar for longer than usual. Second, and more significantly, Sarah Whitmore made a fateful decision. During a rare solo trip to Philadelphia to deliver correspondence and collect payments, she sought out Elijah Thompson, whose investigation she had learned about through her family's surveillance of potential threats. Lasting over 3 hours, their meeting was held in the back room of a Quaker bookshop. Female W provided confirmation of all suspicions and, worse beyond imagining, Thompson's coded notes, deciphered decades later, recorded. Family operation more extensive than previously documented. Estimate 70+ adult victims. 20+ children since beginning. Detailed processing methods and distribution network. Names of participating church officials. See separate encoded list. Most disturbing, underground chamber beneath main workshop contains remains in various stages of processing plus archived samples of all victims. Small preserved portions kept as quality control references labeled with names and dates. Sarah agreed to help Thompson obtain physical evidence, providing him with a hand-drawn map of the workshop complex, including the hidden entrance to the underground processing chamber. She also revealed the existence of a ledger kept by Elizabeth Whitmore that documented every acquisition and distribution since the business began, a meticulous record of decades of horror that would provide irrefutable evidence if obtained. "I know I condemn myself by revealing these things," Sarah reportedly told Thompson. "I expect no mercy in this world or the next, but the children's faces give me no peace, and I cannot allow more innocents to feed my family's ungodly work." Recognizing both the value and risk of Sarah's information, Thompson arranged for her to stay with trusted Quaker contacts rather than return to the Whitmore compound. This decision, while well-intentioned, accelerated the approaching confrontation. When Sarah failed to return as scheduled, William Whitmore immediately suspected betrayal. According to Thomas Whitmore's later confession, the family held a tense council upon realizing Sarah's defection. William was coldly furious, pacing the study while suggesting increasingly violent courses of action. Father, weakened by his illness, sat slumped in his chair, occasionally muttering prayers or biblical passages about Judas and betrayal. Mother remained calm, methodically listing the vulnerabilities Sarah's absence created and the evidence that needed to be eliminated. I argued for flight, abandoning the workshop and starting anew elsewhere. But William would not hear of surrendering the business he viewed as his birthright. The family decided on a two-pronged strategy. William would track Sarah to eliminate the immediate threat, while Elizabeth would oversee the relocation of their most incriminating materials to a secondary location, an abandoned mineshaft on the property's western edge that had been converted years earlier for storage. What they could not know was that Thompson had already begun assembling a coalition of authorities to act on Sarah's information. Recognizing that local officials might include Whitmore allies, he approached the Philadelphia yearly meeting's most influential members, who in turn engaged trusted contacts within the newly formed state government. By February 12, 1788, a plan was in place to raid the Whitmore compound and gather evidence of their crimes. Fearing delay would give the Whites time to destroy evidence, Thompson made the fateful decision to proceed with a smaller force rather than wait for better conditions when a snowstorm descended upon Chester County the night before the planned raid, hampering travel and communications. He departed Philadelphia with 6 armed men, including 2 constables and 4 Quaker volunteers committed to ending the Whitmore atrocities. What followed was described by multiple sources as the night of unholy discovery, an encounter with human depravity that would haunt all involved for the remainder of their lives. With howling winds driving snow horizontally across the Pennsylvania countryside, February 13, 1788, arrived. Elijah Thompson and his small party reached the outskirts of the Whitmore property shortly after nightfall, their lanterns struggling against the darkness and swirling snow. They approached on foot, following Sarah's map toward the workshop rather than the main house. "We moved like ghosts through the storm," wrote James Pearson, one of the Quaker volunteers, in an account sealed alongside Thompson's records. "The wind masked our approach, but also prevented us from hearing activity within the buildings. The workshop windows glowed with lantern light despite the late hour, an ominous sign that our arrival might not be unexpected. The men positioned themselves around the structure, with Thompson and the 2 constables approaching the main door while others covered potential escape routes. Their plan was to secure any occupants quickly, then locate the hidden entrance to the underground chambers Sarah had described. Announcing official business, Thompson knocked firmly. After a moment of silence, the door opened to reveal Thomas Whitmore, his tall frame silhouetted against the workshop's interior light. He showed no surprise at our presence, Pearson recorded. His eyes moved over our small party as if counting. Then he stepped aside with an unsettling calm, inviting us to enter if we must. I sensed immediately that something was terribly wrong. His manner suggested not the panic of discovery, but the composed resignation of a man who had prepared for this moment. Appearing as any craftsman's space inside the workshop's main floor, tools hung in precise order, partially completed religious items were arranged on workbenches, the scent of wood shavings and varnish hanging in the air. Standing with hands clasped before him, Thomas responded to Thompson's direct questions with monosyllabic answers, while his eyes continually drifted toward a large cabinet against the far wall. Moving toward the cabinet, Constable William Bradford found it unlocked, following this gaze. Inside, rather than tools or supplies, he discovered a black velvet pouch containing what appeared to be a preserved human finger. Upon this discovery, Thomas Whitmore's demeanor changed. He sank to his knees, muttering what sounded like prayers or confessions, Bradford later testified. When questioned about other family members, he revealed that his father lay ill in the main house while his mother and brother William had departed hours earlier with several large trunks heading west toward the property's edge. To intercept Elizabeth and William, Thompson immediately dispatched 2 men while he and the remaining party pressed Thomas to reveal the entrance to the underground chamber. After initial resistance, Thomas led them to a workbench that, when slid aside, exposed a trap door set into the workshop floor. "The smell that rose from that opening struck us like a physical blow," Pearson wrote. A miasma of chemical preservatives mixed with the unmistakable stench of human decay. Thomas lit a lantern and led us down narrow wooden stairs into darkness that seemed to swallow the light. What we found below exceeds my ability to describe without compromising my soul's peace. Yet the truth must be recorded, no matter how abhorrent. Beneath both the workshop and beyond extended the underground chamber, a series of rooms carved from the earth and reinforced with timber supports. The first space contained workbenches similar to those above, but the implements laid upon them were clearly designed for surgical precision rather than woodworking. Glass containers of various sizes held liquids whose purposes the men dared not contemplate. A large drain in the center of the stone floor led to a system of channels that disappeared into the walls. Everything was meticulously organized, Bradford reported. Notebooks containing detailed procedures sat beside surgical instruments arranged by size and purpose. One volume open to a recently used page contained drawings of human anatomy with specific sections highlighted and annotated with preservation instructions. The true horror of the Whitmore operation was revealed in the adjacent room. Here, 3 bodies in various stages of processing hung suspended from iron hooks set into the ceiling beams, 2 adults, a man and a woman, and 1 child estimated to be 9 or 10 years old. With surgical precision, each had been partially dissected, their remains treated with preservatives that gave the exposed tissue an unnatural waxy appearance. Most disturbing was the third chamber, which Thomas referred to in a hollow voice as the archive. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined all 4 walls, holding hundreds of small wooden boxes, each meticulously labeled with names, dates, and locations. Random inspection revealed that each box contained a preserved human fragment, a piece of bone, a section of skin, a small organ or tissue sample kept as a reference catalogue of all the saints the Whiters had created and distributed. At the center of this room stood a large wooden table bearing Elizabeth Whitmore's ledger, the business record Sarah had described. This massive volume documented in cold commercial terms the acquisition of victims, the processing of their remains, and the distribution of resulting relics to churches throughout the eastern seaboard, Thompson wrote. Each entry included the price paid, the church receiving the items, and notes on the fabricated provenance provided to the purchasers. Now seemingly resigned to his fate, Thomas Whitmore revealed that the operation had processed 79 adults and 22 children since its inception in 1745. Over 40 churches across 7 states had been supplied with relics by the family, generating wealth that had been carefully laundered through legitimate businesses and land holdings. When asked how they selected their victims, Thomas's response chilled the investigators to their core. Mother had the discernment. She could sense those whose bodies would produce the most powerful relics, the truly devout, the innocents, those whose suffering purified them for sacred purpose. She taught William to see it, too. They would watch at church gatherings, at revival meetings, identifying those whose flesh might bring miracles. For hours, the investigation of the underground chambers continued, with the men documenting their findings as thoroughly as their shaken state allowed. As dawn approached, a commotion from above drew them back to the workshop level, where they found the 2 men who had been sent to intercept Elizabeth and William Whitmore. One was seriously injured, bleeding from a deep knife wound to his shoulder. William Whitmore fought like one possessed, the wounded man reported. We found them at the abandoned mineshaft, as Thomas had indicated, transferring boxes from a wagon into the entrance. When confronted, Elizabeth attempted to reason with us, offering money for our silence, while William circled behind. He struck without warning, a butcher's precision to his violence. My companion is dead, his throat cut before I could intervene. The Whitmores fled into the forest with what they could carry. A broader manhunt was organized as daylight broke, with messengers sent to alert authorities in neighboring counties. Nathaniel Whitmore was found in the main house, too weakened by illness to have participated in the recent activities. He offered no resistance when taken into custody, alternating between religious justifications for his family's work and apparent confusion about his surroundings. For 3 days, the search for Elizabeth and William Whitmore continued before reaching its gruesome conclusion. Their bodies were discovered in a small hunting cabin 12 miles from the family property, arranged side by side on a crude altar constructed from local materials. Both had consumed poison after apparently performing some form of ritual whose exact nature remains unclear. Notes found at the scene suggested they believed their deaths would consecrate the remaining relics they had managed to salvage during their escape. Tried in Philadelphia in April 1788 was Thomas Whitmore. Due to the sensational and disturbing nature of the crimes, the proceedings were conducted with unusual secrecy. After providing a complete confession that corroborated the physical evidence found at the family compound, he was hanged on May 7, 1788. The most challenging question facing authorities was how to handle the hundreds of human remains that had been distributed as relics to unsuspecting churches. The decision reached after lengthy deliberation involving both government and religious leaders prioritized preventing public panic and religious disillusionment over full disclosure. Unprecedented challenges for both civil and religious authorities in the young United States were presented by the aftermath of the Whitmore family's horrific enterprise. At a time when such faith was considered essential to the moral foundation of the new nation, the full truth threatened to undermine public faith in religious institutions. After consultation with leaders from various denominations, a decision was reached that would shape how this dark chapter would be remembered, or rather deliberately forgotten. We determined that the faithful should be protected from knowledge that might devastate their spiritual foundations, wrote Judge William Bradford in a sealed memorandum to the Pennsylvania governor. The churches that unknowingly participated in this abomination need not bear the burden of public shame or lose the confidence of their congregations. Therefore, all records of this investigation shall be sealed for a period not less than 100 years, and officials involved are bound to silence by oath. Privately informed of their true nature were the churches that had purchased Whitmore relics. Given the option of having the human remains quietly collected for proper Christian burial in unmarked graves or allowing the church leaders to handle the matter themselves with absolute discretion was each institution. According to Thompson's final report, most chose the latter option, unwilling to involve even the discreet government representatives in what was viewed as a profound desecration of their sacred spaces. What the authorities could not have anticipated was how many church leaders decided upon a third option, one that speaks to the darkest aspects of human psychology and religious conviction. Of the 43 churches identified in Elizabeth Whitmore's ledger, historical records suggest that at least 17 chose to retain the human remains, continuing to present them as authentic relics while knowing their true origins. The justification offered by these clergy was disturbing in its pragmatism, Thompson noted in his final entry before the records were sealed. Several expressed the view that since the miracles associated with these remains had occurred regardless of their provenance, perhaps God had indeed sanctified these poor victims through their unwilling sacrifice. Others spoke more practically of the donations, increased attendance, and enhanced prestige their churches had gained through possession of these powerful relics. To surrender these advantages, they argued, would harm their congregations more than continuing the deception. Finding this reasoning abhorrent was Thompson, a man of unwavering moral principle. His final efforts focused on creating a confidential registry of every Whitmore victim whose identity could be established, along with the location of their remains, if known. This document, intended to ensure that these individuals would not be completely erased from history, was included in the sealed records with instructions that it be used to provide proper memorialization when the truth could finally be acknowledged. In what was officially recorded as an accidental fire, though multiple accounts suggest it was deliberately set by local authorities to eliminate any remaining evidence of the horrors that had occurred there, the Whitmore property was burned to the ground. Reclaimed by the state, the land was eventually divided and sold to families who knew nothing of its history. Sarah Whitmore, whose courage had helped expose her family's crimes, was provided with a new identity and relocated to Boston, where she lived under Quaker protection until her death in 1823. Maintained until her final days, her journal reveals a woman haunted by guilt, yet determined to honor the victims through a life dedicated to charitable works, particularly those benefiting orphan children. "I cannot undo what my family wrought," she wrote in her final entry. but each child I helped to safety and education stands against the darkness we created. I have lived 40 years attempting to balance scales that can never be truly balanced. I go to my judgment with no expectation of mercy, only the hope that those we harmed have found the peace we stole from them. The physical evidence of the Whitmore family's crimes, the surgical tools, preservation formulas, and workshop apparatus was supposedly destroyed after the trial. However, rumors persisted for decades that certain items had been quietly preserved by medical schools or private collectors fascinated by the technical innovations the family had developed for tissue preservation. Of particular interest to early medical researchers were the Whitmore's techniques for maintaining the lifelike appearance and flexibility of preserved human tissue, methods that William Whitmore had apparently developed through years of gruesome experimentation. Several early 19th century medical texts contain oblique references to preservation processes that bear striking similarities to those described in the Whitmore case records, though never with direct attribution to their true source. The story of the Whitmore family might have remained completely buried were it not for a courthouse fire in Philadelphia in 1879. As water-damaged documents were removed for restoration, several sealed packets from the 1788 case were mistakenly included with regular court records being processed. A clerk discovered portions of Thomas Whitmore's confession and alerted his superiors, who quickly resealed the documents. However, rumors of their content circulated among courthouse employees.